Okay, if I can get everybody's attention real quick. That's as loud as I can get. If I can get everybody's attention real quick. So as we're kind of going through this class and we're talking about, can I get everybody's attention, please? So as we're walking through the class about women's and men's role in the Bible, there's something that I've shared in here several times that's real deep on my heart. I work with the Genesis Women's Shelter here, and I have for several years now. I'm on the board for the Hero program, which is just a men's auxiliary group. We're having a Heroes breakfast on February the 14th. So all I'm asking today is that if there's any men in here, because the problem of domestic violence, especially against women, is primarily 99% on us. It's on us guys. And I decided a long time ago that instead of being part of the problem, I want to be part of the solution. So if there's any man in here who would like to just come to this breakfast, it's just kind of a greeting thing. There's probably going to be close to 200 men there, and it's just an introductory. It's going to be on February the 14th on a Wednesday, and it's around, I think, 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. So if you work, it might be kind of whatever. If you're interested, come see me after class. It's $25. I'll pay for your ticket. So if anybody has any interest in going and can go, come see me. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. We have so much to cover today. So much. I have to start with a special announcement. As I announced when we were doing class in the sessions back in the fall, I've had a trip planned to Israel for this past summer, a study trip. And with the ongoing situation, even though certain things have improved, other things are still very problematic. We made the decision with the tour company that that trip wasn't possible. But the tour company said, you know what? They said there's another group in the Dallas area, not far from you, that has been planning a trip that they're honestly having a little bit of trouble getting enough people signed up for. And they said, what would you think about partnering with them and co-leading a trip? And I said, well, how's that going to work? You know, I've got a style and a way I do things, and is that going to fit? And, you know, 2 roosters in the yard, is that going to work? And so he said, why don't you go meet with them and talk about it? So I went and I met with this guy, and we hit it off really, really well. Very similar styles, very similar thoughts on different things. And so with that in mind, we decided that we will co-lead a trip. And that trip is covering the growth of the early church in Asia Minor, ancient Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. What was also nice is that the dates are exactly the same as the trip that I was planning to Israel. In fact, it just leaves one day later. And so we have this trip where it's a little bit late, I recognize, to try to pull things together. But it's kind of fascinating to think about the fact that in Israel we talk about this small group of Jewish, honestly, boys that are charged to go into all the world. And how is it that this group of Jewish followers, largely uneducated, managed to go into a Greco-Roman world and spread the gospel to where Christianity becomes an official religion of the Roman Empire in less than 300 years? How in the world did they do it? And that's what this tour explores. How do they go about doing it? Because the secret is that the way things work in the Greco-Roman world are a whole lot like how they work in our world. So there's some things we can learn about how we spread the gospel today. The tour company's put together a little video. It talks about a Greece and Turkey tour. This is just Turkey, but it still shows some things that I think are kind of fun. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes and show this.
It wasn't really ever on my bucket list. I actually saw the ad on Facebook to come to Turkey and immediately signed up.
You read all this stuff in the Bible, but until you're actually there and you can see the land and you can see the cities and feel the way the wind blows and the flowers bloom and everything, it comes to life for you.
We're here in Turkey, and Turkey is home of the majority of the New Testament.
We've walked on streets that undoubtedly the Apostle Paul has walked on.
Walking down the marble street just like he was, and just imagine what he was going through.
On the first missionary journey, he and Barnabas came to this place. We were actually able to read the sermon that he preached in the synagogue, where he preached it.
It's been interesting for me going just a little bit past the Bible into the formation of the early church and how the Christians lived together. For me, that's been very fascinating to kind of dive into that world, and Turkey's great for that. Such an ancient part of our Christian story.
At GTI, our passion is to bring the land and the lessons of the Bible to life. And what we try to do on the signature tour is not only just focus on the Bible and what the New Testament has to offer here in Turkey, but we try to bring the cultural aspect alive as well.
It's amazing to get to experience the way the people live here now.
The people are so gracious and loving and such servants.
To see the way they live, to see their customs, to go to a mosque, to see how distinct it is and how beautiful it is. It is really a treasure for us.
The rug making that we came to today is just probably one of my favorite cultural experiences here in Turkey. I will never look at a rug the same way.
To be stationary up in the air or near stationary and just to be able to look around and see things, it's an amazing perspective. This looks a lot like it did 2,000 years ago.
It's just a gift. To walk in the footsteps of Paul and to see things as Paul did 2,000 years ago is almost a paradigm shift in your walk of faith.
That's it for the plug. I will say 75%, something like that, of the New Testament is either written by, to, or from, or about people in Asia Minor. So it's a very significant area for understanding the early church, and it's very safe. It is the Roman ruins, Greco-Roman ruins in Asia Minor in Turkey are far better preserved and much more numerous than they are in Greece or even in Italy. So it's kind of the place to go. If you want to find out more info, you can go to my website, steppingintothejordan.com, and there's a study trips tab, and that will take you to a place where you can find the information. And we'll post this PowerPoint up on the website later this week, and you can use the direct link right there to get to the study trips. Okay, part two of the big but. I want to do a very brief recap of what we talked about last week, and then move right into the rest of this passage. Last week we looked at this very problematic phrase that we have in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, where he says, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." And we looked at that basically from this idea of an article that was put together by Dr. Linda Belleville, who is an adjunct professor at Cornerstone University, which is a pretty conservative theological seminary. And outside of the complicated title, what she really questions is, how is it that we translate some words here that are very rare words? And so a recap of last week, we said that Paul commands women to learn, first of all, which was contrary to practice of the day. That this verb that we translate as to have authority over, this verb authentane, is only used one time in the Bible, in this passage. And when you look at it outside of the Bible, in classical Greek literature and in sort of everyday artifacts of written Greek of the day, the best definition is probably to dominate. It's also a rare word in those contexts. And that we then have this neither to teach nor to dominate, what are two subordinate clauses, that there are ways we translate those clauses, and in this case, it's probably best understood as a purpose or a goal, so reflecting motive. And that Paul's statement is not a universal ban on the prohibition against women teaching. It is a prohibition against teaching with the wrong motives or for the wrong purpose. And so we were left with two possible options for how to translate this. One is, I do not permit a woman to teach a man in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor. Or, because the word for woman and man also can mean husband or wife, another way to say it could be, I do not permit a wife to teach a husband in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor. Which one is right? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I opt for the first one because I think it fits with the general context of the passage, but I wouldn't want to bet my salary on it. So today we're going to look at the social context of 1 Timothy. Last week I avoided the social context completely. I wanted us to look at the grammar, the Greek. Today we're going to look at social context. And my first warning, whenever we look at social context, we need to understand we can never fully understand the social context of an ancient time. Okay? We just can't. We always bring our own baggage with us. Okay? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to see things through their eyes, recognizing that we may be limited in how we do it. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is mostly coming from this book by Dr. Sandra Glahn. She's a professor of media arts and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary. Again, very conservative, evangelical institution. And her research area is first century background of women, culture, gender, and the arts. And this book, Nobody's Mother, is about Artemis of the Ephesians in antiquity and the New Testament. Fascinating, fascinating book. And she does a very, very careful study of some things we're going to kind of go through parts of today. And so we're going to look at the last half, these last couple bits about Paul, what seems to be his justification for what he says above it. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. So, here's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at a little bit about this cult of Artemis, and by cult I mean religion, of Artemis in Ephesus and its relationship to the city of Ephesus. We're going to look at how Paul references other deities in his letters. There is a small translation challenge in this section we're going to talk about. And then we're going to have to do a little bit of speculation on the social challenges facing the church in Ephesus. So, one thing that we don't talk about a lot, but is worthwhile knowing, is that when we look at chapters and verses as we know them in our Bibles, those were not put in there until the 1400s. Okay? They're not part of the original text. They were added later for referenceability. Furthermore, in Greek nor in Hebrew do we have punctuation like we have in English. Okay? So that raises a couple of questions. How do we know where sentences begin and where they end? And how do we know where paragraphs begin and end? Without the kind of punctuation marks that we see in our Bible, how do we know these things? How do we know where to split the text? Any ideas?
They didn't have the spacing either.
Oh, good. Yes, I haven't even gotten into that. In Greek especially, there's not even spacing. It's like, and guess what? They even will break words going to the next line. And sometimes it's like this. It's you know how we go like left to right, left to right, left to right. Hebrew goes right to left, right to left, right to left. Sometimes they'll go like this, okay? And sometimes they'll go right to left or left to right. And if it's in the middle of a word and they've run out of space as they're marking or chiseling, well, that next letter goes on the next line. Okay? So sometimes we get grammatical clues. One thing nice about Hebrew is that it breaks things into clauses. And it uses it by using the word or the symbol and. And so if you were to read it like it's written, it's this and this and this and this. But sometimes that and can be but, depending on word order. So sometimes there are grammatical clues as to how things get broken. And sometimes we need to break up expressions into sentences even when they don't exist in the original context. And I've got a good example. I'm not going to read it for the sake of time, but this is my Greek New Testament. Romans chapter 1. Okay. Look at this on your own, but verses 1 through 7 in the Greek is one sentence. It's a run-on sentence. Paul is famous for his run-on sentences. Okay? So, 7 verses, all one sentence, and in English it's in multiple sentences, right? Because they're trying to break up the thoughts. But for Paul, it's one big long sentence. Okay? Sometimes context can help us. And sometimes we find in ancient manuscripts, we see little annotations that will mark, okay, here's where the new paragraph starts. Okay? We don't have it consistently, but sometimes where you break a paragraph really is the interpreter's choice. Where does he think one line of thought ends and another begins? And we'll see an example of this later on. And we need to remember that chapters, verses, and sentence and paragraph breaks are not part of the quote-unquote inspired text. Okay? They're added very, very late. Okay? So, keep that in the back of your mind. Now we're going to look at Artemis of the Ephesians. This is a statue of Artemis. This is from the museum in Ephesus. What do you notice about her?
Looks like she has a bunch of eggs.
Oh, okay. She's got a bunch of something around here. Okay. What do we know about Artemis? Anybody know anything about Artemis?
Fertility god.
Oh. So, how do we know that?
Because of her eggs.
Okay. So there's this idea, this general idea, and it's fairly common around that Artemis was a fertility goddess. And the idea being, well, then you see all those things, well, that's just multiple breasts. We're going to look carefully at that because that's one of the things Glahn does very, very well, is she goes through and she looks at all of the evidence, all the literary evidence around this, and compares it with what some modern interpreters say to see if there's any distinction. And so let's look at Artemis in literature, ancient literature. She is the daughter of Zeus and his lover Leto. She has a twin brother Apollo. Artemis was born first. And because the gods tend to be born fully formed, she's present with her mother while her mother is giving birth to Apollo. And apparently it was a fairly rough pregnancy. And needless to say that Zeus's wife, Hera, has it out for these kids because they're not hers. Okay? And there's a whole lot of stories around Artemis and Apollo that I'm not going to go into. But for the sake of just what she's known for, she's known as a queen of the wild beasts. She is a huntress, known as being an archer. She is an eternal virgin goddess. Apparently the only male she was ever attracted to was Orion. And after he died, she had no interest in other men or male gods. She's an eternal virgin goddess. She's also a goddess of death, especially for women. And so there's this kind of weird dichotomy we'll talk about. She is also a healer who specializes in the painless delivery and even the painless death, especially related to childbearing for women. In the ancient sources, she is not a fertility goddess. There is no ancient evidence that says Artemis of the Ephesians is a fertility goddess. In fact, she's just the opposite. She's completely 100% celibate. Okay? She's also sort of a study in contrast in that she's a goddess who protects women in childbirth, but also has the ability to kill women. She's a goddess of healing who can also spread disease. Okay? Which gets to a little bit of the, an ancient mindset about gods that I don't think we think about. To be contacted by a god was never a good thing. Because the gods were considered to be fickle and selfish and out for their own interests. And I think we see that a bit in how we see this sort of dichotomy. She protects, she kills. She heals, she brings disease. Okay? It's her interests that seem to be in mind more than it is the person who she is, the human who's dealing with her. I think we see that in some of the Old Testament writings too. When people see a god, what's the first thing they think? First it's, oh my God. Second thing is, oh no, I'm going to die. Okay? Being contacted by a god was not a good thing. Having a god give you a mission, find somebody else. I'd rather not. And so it's because of this sort of fickle nature of deities. So, what do we know about Artemis in Ephesus? This is the stadium, the amphitheater at Ephesus. This is where in Acts 19, Paul, there's a big riot in the city of Ephesus because of the silver makers that are making little Artemis idols get all up in arms that he's starting to impact their business, and he wants to speak to them, and they won't let him go in. And it's pretty easy to understand when you get there why they won't let him go in, because there's only 2 exits. So if they decided they wanted to attack him and kill him, he's really got no way out. So they prevent him from going in and speaking in this arena. But Ephesus in the 1st century is a very, very large port city. It is a major banking center. It is the guardian city of Artemis's temple. And it's also a guardian city for the Roman imperial cult. I don't recall which emperor it was set up his temple for worship of the emperor in Ephesus as well. Artemis's temple, and really the city as a whole, is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it's a very important city for early Christianity. Paul, John, Priscilla, Aquila, Jesus' mother Mary, I could go on. There's a big, big list of people that either live in or pass through Ephesus for some period of time. Really because of all of this. It's a major hub of transportation and trade, and a very, very wealthy city. It is today, although it doesn't have the same connotation, it's a bit like Houston. Big port. I mean, without all the oil refineries, right? But it's a big port, a kind of big financial center, big business center, very international, very cosmopolitan, sort of a city. I think that's kind of a good way to look at it. Well, Ephesus has some origin stories. Where did the city come from? How did it get its start? And one of those origin stories is that Ephesus was founded by the Amazons. Who are the Amazons?
Giant women leaders, warriors.
Warrior women. Okay? We've actually found graves of women from Scythia, which is in this same sort of area, with weapons. They were, at that time, they estimate their height was 5'6", which put them very tall compared even to some of the men.
Women Nephilim.
Women Nephilim, yeah. So they were women warriors. And the Greeks were fascinated with them because in one sense, that wasn't the role for women, right, in the Greco-Roman world. But in another, it was like, but these women are warriors, okay? So there's this sort of love-hate relationship with the Amazons. And this story says that Ephesus was named after their leader. And the Amazons were the guardian of the Artemis cult in Ephesus. Here is an ancient account. It says the people of Ephesus declared that Artemis and Apollo were not born at Delos, which is where one story places the whole birth story at, as was the vulgar belief, and vulgar here just means common. They had in their own country a river Cancreus, which is part of the Artemis-Apollo origin story. The grove Ortygia, which is where their mother has them, where Leto, as she leaned in the pangs of labor on an olive tree, still standing, gave birth to those two deities, whereupon the grove at the divine intimation was consecrated. So the place where they were born is where this temple gets built. There Apollo himself pardoned the suppliant Amazons who had gathered round the shrine, subsequently by the permission of Hercules, when he was subduing Lydia, which is another city in the area. The grandeur of the temple ceremony was augmented, and during the Persian rule, its privileges were not curtailed. That's Tacitus from his book, The Annals. And Tacitus lived right around the same time this letter is being written to Timothy. So we see here in this story, we see the link between Ephesus, Artemis, and the Amazons. Okay? All related to that cult. Now, remind me, Apollo and Artemis are twins. Who's born first? Artemis. Okay. So now let's look at Paul in Ephesus. This is actually a house in Ephesus in the upper part of the city, which is one of the wealthy areas. And I want to look at how Paul deals with other gods. In Paul's letters, he does something really weird. He never mentions other gods by name. Not once. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have something to say about other gods, because he tends to do it indirectly. Okay? He'll make slide comments or that kind of talk about a god without mentioning that god's name. Okay? As opposed to in Acts, I think there's actually mention of some other gods, right? Where Luke will bring that out. But in Paul's letters, he doesn't ever mention them directly. But it's possible, because we're not familiar with the nature of these gods and how they worked within their areas, that we may miss the references because we don't know about their importance in an ancient context. Okay? So, with that in mind, I want to look here. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Do Do you see an Artemis connection? What is it?
Artemis was first, and she's second.
Oh.
Eve is second here.
Artemis was formed first, Apollo second. Okay? And Paul seems to flip that. He says, hey, but Adam was formed first, and then Eve. We'll talk about the next statement in a minute. But I want to ask, is Paul mandating hierarchy here?
It sounds like it to me,
Okay.
but I feel like I've walked into a trap.
Did I hear another
It's
comment?
got something to do with the prior statement. This is his proof, if you will,
Okay.
of what he said before.
Okay. Yeah, this is linked to the prior statement and somehow about teaching in a domineering way. Okay? Let's look at what I think is happening here, and we'll look at some other examples that I think will help back this up. Paul is denigrating Artemis, and he's disputing the Artemis-Apollo female-male pairing. Okay? In the Genesis account, okay, man is first in the Genesis of the male-female pairing, not the woman. And then he's kind of saying, even the man was not deceived. I think what Paul is doing is he's using the Genesis narrative to counter a local competing narrative about Artemis and the superiority of Artemis and her temple in the city of Ephesus. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at this created order argument. Okay? That Adam was created first. And does that imply that Adam has a authority because of where he's created first? I want you to think about that for a minute. If that's really true, then where is Adam in the overall created order? He's not at the top. Okay? That would put the sun, the plants, the moon, the animals, all above,
The water, the earth.
everything above Adam. And the only thing under Adam? Eve. Well, then the other argument goes, oh, but he's created last. Well, is he created last? No, the woman's created last. Okay? So the created order arguments don't hold water depending on either way that you want to use it. But we're going to look at that for a minute. I don't think Paul's using a created order argument, because here's what he says in other places. This is 1 Corinthians. He says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman. But all things come from God. Okay? Or he goes on to say, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Okay, who is the your thoughts here? Is it just women?
It's the Christians. The Christians.
It's everybody. Okay? Paul is talking to men and women. So I don't think that Paul is making a statement about Adam and Eve in terms of hierarchy being related to why a woman can't teach. Because here he says, he uses the example of Eve being deceived to say, all of your thoughts are being led astray. Okay? And before he says there's no difference in men and women. All are created by God. So I think what he's doing here is that deception, first of all, is not about biology or state of being. One is not more prone to deception than the other. What I think he's doing is he's getting at some sort of a statement or some sort of an origin around Artemis and Artemis's birth versus Apollo as it relates to God's story of Adam and Eve in creation. And that the deception is just part of that overall story. But the really weird one is about the childbearing. And I want you to notice something. He says, yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. Do you see a grammatical problem? What is it?
Who's they?
Oh, first it goes from she, singular, to they, plural. He doesn't say she will be saved through childbearing provided she continues in faith and love and holiness with modesty. She says they. So here's what Glon says that I think is really interesting. She says that hidden in this verse is what's called a proverbial saying. And Paul is fond of doing this. He will quote a proverbial saying, and then he will comment on it. So, for example, everything is permissible for me. Does anyone know what the rest of that is? But not everything is beneficial. And what most scholars agree is that what Paul's doing is he's quoting a commonly known phrase. Everything is beneficial for me. And he says, but, everything is permissible, but, then he comments, but everything is not beneficial. It may be permissible, but it's not beneficial. Then he'll say, everything is lawful for me, but everything is not beneficial. I think he uses the same in both. And there are other places where Paul does this. He'll quote something that either someone said in a letter to him and then comment on it, or he will say some common saying. And what Glon says is she says, in this verse, there is a proverbial saying hidden. And the clue has to do with the change in number from she to they. And what she thinks is, the common saying is, she will be saved through childbearing. And then she says, Paul adds his comment, provided they continue in faith, love, holiness, with modesty. Now, why might that be a legitimate saying around the city of Ephesus with its main temple to Artemis?
She was the protector of women in childbirth.
Oh. She's the protector of women in childbirth. Now, we're going to use, as some womanist scholars say, our divine imagination. Imagine you are a first century woman in Ephesus. You have a couple of kids, and incidentally, within the Greco-Roman Empire, Caesar Augustus, not too long before, realized that the number of highborn and upper-class people was declining versus the slave population. So he issued an edict that gave certain benefits and privileges to women and families that had more than 3 children. And so, assume you're this woman, you've had some children. You have, since your last child was born, you have become a Christian. And you're pregnant again. And in the past, you would go to the temple of Artemis to offer sacrifices to protect you during the birth of your children, because, let's face it, in an ancient world, death during childbirth is a big, big issue. But now you're a Christian, and you can't go to Artemis. Or worse, perhaps you're not fully convinced that, Artemis isn't real. Perhaps you think, well, I worship this God and, his Messiah, Jesus Christ, but maybe Artemis is going to be ticked. Or another scenario, you're a woman whose husband has converted to Christianity, and as we see commonly in Acts, it says the whole household converts. That doesn't mean everybody in the household has a choice. Okay? Your husband has converted, and therefore you have been drug along into this new religion, and you're pregnant, and you're not allowed to go make the sacrifices you would make to Artemis to protect you during your pregnancy and childbirth. How are you feeling? And what do you do? And so what Glahn says she thinks Paul is doing is Paul is dealing with an immediate issue in that church of women who have had to leave that Artemis cult either voluntarily or because of their husbands, who are now pregnant, who are worried about what's going to happen to them without the protection of Artemis during childbearing. And Paul's answer is yes. He quotes this saying, she will be saved through childbearing, which she supposes is possibly related to the Artemis cult. And then Paul's comment is, but they, provided, it's true, this is a true statement, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. All the things he's talked about earlier in the letter.
Is that a pretty good translation from the Greek?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And incidentally, that will be saved. Okay, she will be saved. Whenever will be saved shows up in Greek, it's always talking about either eternal salvation or physical deliverance, physical salvation. So what Glahn suggests is that perhaps a better way to examine this, there's one other issue that leads into this. And that is, if you look at 3:1, 1 Timothy 3:1, it says, the saying is sure, or the saying is faithful. And in most of our Bibles, if you look at it, it puts that statement with what follows after it. Something about, someone desiring to be an elder or a deacon. But her argument is, in context, if this is a saying, a common saying, then this statement fits here and not with what's below it. And incidentally, when Paul does that, he uses that phrase a lot. Sometimes he puts it before the statement, sometimes he puts it after. Okay? And Glahn notes that some translations move this to the end of the paragraph to be not part of the next paragraph. So, how does this relate to childbearing and Artemis? Okay, perhaps the better reading is delivered through childbirth or during childbirth. We've talked about how she's the aid to women during childbirth. This was a real issue in the ancient world. And so what I think is happening is that Paul is quoting a saying possibly related to Artemis to reassure Christian women that they're still protected in childbirth even though they're no longer worshiping Artemis. So if we put all this together, let's go back to the beginning and we'll add 3:1 to the end. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Okay, we see anger and argument on the part of the men as being an issue here. Also, that women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Let them learn in silence with full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach a man in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be delivered through childbearing, provided they continue in faith, love, and holiness with modesty. This saying is trustworthy. I think that's what Paul's saying. Questions, comments?
So if the man and woman could have been translated husband and wife, would the they there be the wife and the husband?
Could the they be, oh, possibly, yes. Yeah, possibly.
Are you saying that the verse about let a woman learn silence with full submission is more of a, hey, let's let her learn?
It's a command. It's a command, yes. She must learn.
Because in the past, women were not necessary.
That's a cultural, we talked about that last week, right? That's a cultural flip. That was not common practice. Paul's deviating from that common practice by saying, no, they need to learn. Let them learn.
But in silence, they can't ask questions.
No, I think that's probably too strict of a reading of, yeah, how they can learn. I think with full submission is, in other words, if they're going to be students, let them be students, right? Let them learn and be students the way they ought to be students, okay? But the bigger thing is this idea that it's not a permission to teach, period. It's, if they're going to teach, the objective shouldn't be so that they can dominate someone. It should be, they need to teach them in the right way. And we looked last week at Aquila and Priscilla teaching Apollos, okay? And how that was done in a way where they're both involved in it to get him to a better understanding. And that what's happening at the end of this verse is really more social commentary on the Artemis cult and how that works within Ephesus.
So Rob, would it be, is it a part of the silence thing? Is that just so that women, when they are learning, because women of that time that were of that cult, a lot of them came out very strong in what they would say and very argumentative.
That's quite possibly. It's quite possibly.
on.
Yeah, it's quite possibly. Yeah. I mean, yes, ma'am.
But I also think too, if it was so inaccessible or frowned upon, teach me, Dad, in the basement, so to speak, and I can freely ask questions.
Yeah.
Because you really don't want to let your neighbors know you're teaching your daughter, not until the neighbor's daughter is learning the same thing.
Could be.
That's just how I interpret it.
Yeah.
Women today and then and forever have a role really of domineering their children. Dominating, right? That is their role, right? To teach their children how to wash their clothes, whatever it is. But it is different in the discussion, in the conversation with men, husband or men in a synagogue. And I don't know, I see that too, just as a wife and mother.
Okay. There was a comment back here, and then Tim.
You said the last couple of sentences there, you think the word digs and Artemis. I don't understand how that is a proof of let a woman, I do not permit a woman to teach, or a reason for his statement, I do not permit a woman to teach a man to domineer his wife and have a wife to be.
Yeah.
The part after that says for, as in, the way I read that is because. And I don't see how a dig at Artemis connects with that.
Yeah, I think of all of Glen's arguments, I think this is the weakest. Okay, her argument is it seems to relate to how Artemis and Apollo are born. That the woman is not first. The man, the woman is first in that, and she's viewing it as more of a statement that of the creation story than of an argument. It's probably the weakest part of her argument. But again, I don't think we can say that all women are deceived because Eve was deceived, right? Because Paul argues against that in 1 Corinthians, right? So that becomes the issue. If we make that argument here, then we have to deal with 1 Corinthians where Paul says to everyone, don't be like Eve, okay? he's not making a statement of,
I'm not sure exactly what it does mean, but it
Yeah.
doesn't seem to connect as a rationale.
yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't become a rationale for what he says before.
It
Yeah.
seems like this whole section is talking about their worship being in a submissive manner to each other. It's not, women are suddenly being able to learn
Yeah.
about God, but they're supposed to be submissive still to their husbands. And men are supposed to be submissive as well. They talks about them not being angry or argumentative.
Yeah.
And it's all within this context of their culture. What's going on.
Agreed. Yes, sir.
From the way you dissected it last week, the let a woman learn in silence, I think the argument can be made that's directed to the men. Men, be quiet, let the women learn.
Okay, yeah.
That's kind of my takeaway.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The key word was let.
Yeah, let is the, yeah.
Directed at the domineering men. Leave them alone, be quiet, let them learn.
Okay, good. Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't they also be learning from the woman, because the woman is an amazing creature that gives birth to life? And there's a lot to learn from her because she is the one that gives life.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I don't think he's restricting who teaches them. It's that they ought to be taught, right? And he's not prohibiting them from teaching either. Just the meaning or the purpose behind their teaching. I would argue it apply to men too. A man don't teach for the purpose of dominating or domineering someone, right? Nobody should do that. Did I see another hand?
That was what I was going to say.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't looked at the creation story in a while, but when the serpent deceived Eve, she took the fruit and ate of it, and she saw that it was good. She gave it to Adam, who was there with him.
With her, yes.
Was he not culpable in that fall also, or am I missing something?
Yeah, so we saw the one passage where Paul blames Eve. Don't be deceived like Eve. In Romans, what does Paul say? For sin entered the world through one man, not woman, man. Okay, and so salvation comes through one man. Okay? Paul will use the creation story to argue whatever he wants to argue, and he'll flip his argument to make it work. He does that all the time. Tim, did you have another question?
It was a comment.
Okay.
That, yes, it seems like a man shouldn't dominate or teach in a domineering way either. That's not what Paul said. He said, I don't forbid a woman to do that. There must be some reason he said that and not just said to all people.
Yeah. I think there is. And I think there's a cultural reason that we're going to talk about in future lessons about the household code. Okay? Paul does not violate massively the culture of his day. He's a product of the culture of his day. Okay? He will critique slavery, but he doesn't tell slaves to quit being slaves. Okay? He will critique patriarchy, but he doesn't get away with patriarchy. Does that make sense? So he's dealing within that culture of his day, and we're going to look at that. So we are running out of time. Let me just do this quickly for next week. So we've already talked about this. Paul commands women to learn. He prohibits the women or wives from teaching for the purpose of dominating the men or the husbands, but does not say they cannot teach at all. He indirectly critiques tenets of the Artemis cult in Ephesus. God, not Artemis, will protect them during childbirth. And Paul is not issuing a universal prohibition against women teaching, nor does he believe women are inferior to men. Paul is dealing with a local issue specific to that religious landscape. Now, for next week, 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35. Paul makes a very curious statement about women should remain silent because that's what it says in the law. So here's my question. Where in the world in the law does it say women cannot speak? We'll talk about that next week. Thank you all very much. We are past time. Appreciate it.